All right, I want to really quickly go over simple dominance and phenotypic and genotypic ratio. So we're going to start with the example here of dimples. Big D causes dimples. The little d allele causes no dimples. So first we make our key. Big D equals dimples. Big D, little d is also dimples because the big D allele is dominant over the little d allele. So the only way to not have dimples is if you have two little d alleles. Okay, we're going to do this second problem here. Cross two heterozygous dimpled parents. So these two both are dimpled, but only this one is heterozygous, meaning its two alleles are different from each other. One's a big D and one's a little d. So one parent is big D, little d. The other parent is big D, little d. So if this is the mom, when she makes her eggs, half of her eggs are going to have the big D allele, and the other half of her eggs are going to have the little d allele. When the dad makes sperm, half of his sperm have the big D allele, half of his sperm have the little d allele. So if this egg is fertilized by this sperm, the baby will have big D, and have dimples. This sperm fertilizes this egg, the baby will have big D, little d, and also have dimples. If this egg is fertilized by that sperm, big D, little d, again, dimples. Finally, this egg and this sperm makes little d, and no dimples. To do the genotypic ratio, well, you look at the genotypes. Big D is one genotype, big D, little d is another genotype, and little d is the third genotype. So we're going to count how many of each of these genotypes. Genotype. So we start with the dominant, big D. Only one of these four is big D. The second one, big D, little d. Let's see here. 1, 2 of them. Finally, the third genotype is little d, and if you look, again, just one of them. So your genotypic ratio is 1 to 1. Now to do the phenotypic ratio, you look at the phenotypes. If you look here, this side shows you the phenotype. So there are two phenotypes. Either you have dimples or you don't. So how many of these would have dimples? 1, 2, 3. How many do not? 1. And that is how you do genotypic and phenotypic ratio in a simple autosomal recessive, or actually it's dominant trait in this instance, but it's simple dominance. One thing's dominant, one thing's recessive.